welcome to Science Fiction, Race, and Racism, a video blogging channel about the most famous and influential works in science fiction and how they deal with issues of race, ethnicity, racism, prejudice, and intolerance. Both the best and the worst, the most groundbreaking and insightful, and the most callous and clueless. Science fiction has a long history of being opposed to racism, prejudice, and intolerance, but also of conscious or unconscious racism. Sci-fi fans, authors, and works are often said to be above, beyond, incapable of, and far past any prejudice. That is often the appeal of sci-fi, especially the most utopian works. Sometimes a sci-fi setting, story, or theme can be another way to comment upon, critique, or even tear apart prejudice and hatred. For others, sci-fi is pure escapism, a way to get away from such issues. Sometimes this backfires. The most escapist sci-fi works are often the most racist. Sometimes the same three approaches or beliefs coexist within a work of sci-fi, within an author or a sci-fi fan. My name is Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I teach American, American Indian, and Latin American history. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history, including a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. The most influential post-apocalyptic series of all time is Mad Max. Before Mad Max, post-apocalyptic films were usually super serious dramas, often asking questions about the nature of mankind, of good and evil, and man's ability to control his fate and technology. Think of at least a dozen Twilight Zone episodes, or the first few Planet of the Apes films. Some of them were also very silly, cheap monster movies with mutants. Mad Max changed post-apocalyptic films to often fast-paced, full of action, violence, cynicism, and humor. All four Mad Max films are some of the most entertaining, yet thoughtful and intelligent sci-fi ever made, packed full of ideas, often subtle or implied. Yet one huge thing is missing from Mad Max: Aboriginal people, since all these films do take place in Australia. There is not a single Aboriginal character, major or minor, out of dozens of them in any of these films, and only a single extra out of hundreds. This is a post-apocalyptic film series. Aboriginals know how to live in Australia better than anyone. Many also have a fine record as soldiers, and before that, warriors. Aboriginals number 750,000 people, or 1 in 30 of all Australians. In the Northern Territories, they are a third of all people. Fear the Walking Dead shows natives post-zombie apocalypse. It even has Pacific Islanders, who are just 0.5% of the U.S. population. Older post-apocalyptic films like The World, the Flesh, and the Devil had minority characters all the way back in the 1950s. Mad Max was almost the first post-apocalyptic series where the near end of humanity comes not from nuclear weapons, but from environmental breakdown, especially no oil. This led to a political crisis and a social breakdown, as shown in Mad Max 1. In Mad Max 2, called The Road Warrior in the US, the breakdown is complete, and gas is more precious than food or water, even in the deep desert. This implies one of two disturbing possibilities, neither of them said explicitly in any of the four films. One is that Aboriginals went into hiding, back to the bush. The other is that white Australians targeted them and almost wiped them out. Perhaps a combination of that. 70% of Aboriginals today live in Australian cities. Living in the desert would not be easy for them to return to. The likelier reason Aboriginals didn't show up in George Miller's series early on is he simply didn't think of them. The first Mad Max film is only 9 years after the White Australia policy ended. In Australia, you had to be white to immigrate there. And yes, White Australia was the actual official government name for it. Mad Max was only 13 years since Aboriginals had Australian citizenship and the right to vote. In many ways, Australian Aboriginal treatment of Aboriginals was worse than U.S. treatment of natives. This certainly doesn't mean that George Miller is personally a racist. There's no evidence for that, just the opposite. And while Mel Gibson certainly is a bigot, his anti-Semitism, anti-black racism were not yet publicly known. At the time of the first film, he was unknown. with no influence on the direction of the film or its story. The second film, The Road Warrior, was also all white in its cast, but Miller was already thinking about the racial implications of an apocalypse. Many critics called The Road Warrior a futuristic Western, where the bike gangs, with punk rockers wearing mohawks, play the role of Indians. The settlers were the oil rig workers, older whites, mostly blonde. Critic Richard Scheib was the most explicit. He wrote, quote, "Mel Gibson's Max could just as easily be Clint Eastwood's tight-lipped man with no name, helping decent frightened folk from marauding redskins." And yes, he did use the epithet in his review. The film ends with the mohawk-wearing punk rockers defeated, almost wiped out. One of the last lines of the film talks about the colonist, quote, "becoming the great northern tribe," in an area that was once mostly Aboriginal. Miller is implying the white colonist replaced them. The first Mad Max was with people of color at all was Thunderdome, the third film. Tina Turner played the main villain, Auntie Entity, a displaced black American. There was more than a little fear or critique of Americans there. Auntie runs Bartertown, a cross between a post-apocalyptic Tijuana and a post-apocalyptic Vegas, where everything is for sale. The implication is that Turner, or Auntie, a nobody in her own words, can take over just because of the rapacious capitalist nature of Americans, no matter what their race. The other person of color in Thunderdome, most Americans probably didn't realize was one. Angry Anderson played the character called Arnbar. Anderson is well known in Australia as the singer for the hard rock band Rose Tattoo, one of the best known of their hard rock bands, probably the second best known after AC/DC. Anderson is mixed race, Asian and African, as well as white. He has a Mauritian mother. Mauritius is an African nation off the coast of Africa. Its people, though, are not black African. They are a mix of Indian and Chinese, with sometimes a little bit of French descent. Anderson's mother immigrated during the time of white Australia. To do so, she had to prove that she had European ancestry. Ironically, Anderson is something of a Ted Nugent figure in Australia. He became a candidate for an anti-immigrant far-right party, even though his own mother is an immigrant. That party is also viciously anti-Muslim. The Liberty Alliance, sometimes called the Yellow Vest, call for replacing all Muslims in Australia with whites, white South Africans specifically, which they bizarrely and falsely claim are being persecuted in South Africa. Thunderdome ends with a group of children, survivors of a plane crash, who have become very similar to a cargo cult. Cargo cults were in the Pacific Islands. Islanders imitated the behavior of foreign invaders, Americans and Japanese, believing by doing so that they will be rewarded with material goods. In Thunderdome, these child survivors, all white, worship a figure called Captain Walker. They tell the story of his crash and of his leaving. And they build toy planes, make their hair look like planes, and imitate radio traffic, thinking it will bring Walker's return. They mistake Max for Walker. Like Road Warrior, this repeats one of George Miller's central ideas. Whites, post-apocalyptic, will become tribal, much like indigenous people. In Mad Max Fury Road, we see two women, one mixed-race black called Toast the Knowing, and one Asian named Cheeto the Fragile. Both are two of the 5 trophy wives of the main villain, Immortan Joe. And Immortan Joe is not just another white guy. He is unnaturally pale. And not just white, but gray. And bloated where almost everyone else in the film is thin from starvation. Old where almost everybody else dies young. In other words, he's a deliberate parody of white supremacy and represents everything evil in Western society that led to the apocalypse. Now, these 5 women are not really wives, but concubines. They are, for practical purposes, female slaves, and they are kept for sex or to breed children. Toast and Cheeto are almost the only non-whites in this post-apocalyptic Australia, because they are novelties. They are sexual variety for the villain Immortan Joe, one more form of forced labor. They only add to the most disturbing part of the Mad Max world. Aboriginals are missing, either killed off or hiding in remote areas. But for other people of color, they are just as bad off. They don't exist, except as slaves. By the time Fury Road was made, Australia was far less whites only. 1 in 4 Australians today are foreign-born or the children of immigrants. And perhaps half those immigrants or their children are from Europe, but many are from India, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, from various Arab countries, from Turkey and other places. 1 in 8 Australians speaks another language besides English at home. But according to Mad Max Fury Road, when the apocalypse came, white Australians killed off almost all of the people of color and enslaved the rest. George Miller has the bleakest possible view of his fellow white Australians, that they will become genocidal again in the future should an apocalypse come. Is it justified? Australia has come to terms with its history of genocide in many ways better than the US. They admit to genocide, and they officially apologize for it, which the US has not. It's the nations which haven't come to terms that are most likely to commit atrocities again, especially the United States, though no films admitting that have ever been made. This is the end of the 16th video. Please repost freely, like, share, and comment. This has been Science Fiction, Race, and Racism video blog and channel. Look for alternate history series, Latin American Victory, and an earlier series, What Have Natives Won, and other possible future series.